Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Father Gary, for the hospitality of the Newman Centre for Faith and Reason. It's an interesting job that I have here, and I have to tell you that I haven't done it in 2.5 years, so forgive me. What makes it particularly interesting to be chairing this talk this evening, where David Quinn is going to look at the last 2 years and where we taking stock of the last 2 years and where we go from now, is how to introduce David. And because he and I go back a very long way, and I suppose one of the things, I'm so tempted to slag him off because of that, but actually it's really hard to, because he has played such a central role in keeping the rumour of God alive at the heart of the machine, as somebody once said. He's been so instrumental in going out there in good times and in bad, keeping a faith perspective to the fore with tremendous courage and tremendous clarity that I can't really indulge my baser instincts and tease him about anything, except perhaps to say maybe not spend so much time on Twitter. But he's, as you all know, a distinguished journalist of long standing, and I'm very grateful to him for that, because I got my first gig in journalism because he left the Sunday Business Post, and I'm very grateful to him for that. He also, of course, is the founder of the Iona Institute and has been a leading light in that for a long number of years. And as I mentioned, is a commentator of extraordinary clarity and extraordinary courage and extraordinary conviction. So he has to now live up to that in what he says this evening, but I'm quite sure that he will. Would you all welcome, please, Mr. David Quinn.
Thank you, Breda, and thank you for that introduction and for refraining from slagging me.
Too much.
Well, I was thinking as she spoke, so I've been writing for national newspapers since '94. So that's 28 years, and Breda since '97, because that's when I started out in the Sunday Business Post, then went to the Sunday Times, now I'm back at the Sunday Times, so Breda took over my column in the Sunday Business Post. So between us, we're both writing for well over 50 years combined. So it's quite a time when you add it together. It's a long stint. And we're both still surviving in our columns, which is not a bad effort either. In fact, I think probably there's very few columnists really in the country writing longer than either of us. I think maybe Fintan O'Toole and a couple of others. So we're kind of the great survivors in a way at this stage. But look, thank you all for coming tonight. We had a few cancellations over the course of the day because of COVID. And of course, we're in the middle of another wave, so I think there's a few people that are probably a bit nervous to come out, and understandably. But it's good to see you all tonight and see some familiar faces again, and you'll be able to get reacquainted at the end. And I want to thank Father Gary as well, Father Gary Chamberlain, for hosting the event. Again, as our first in Dublin in well over 2 years, again for understandable reasons. We had one actually in Roscommon in November. That was our first public event since the whole thing began. And we had a good turnout, considering it was still social distancing rules and all the rest of it back then. And the talk I gave then is not too unlike the talk I'm going to give tonight, taking stock. And I think taking stock is probably an appropriate enough theme, because isn't that kind of, you've got to take stock after the 2 years we've had. And now we're in this very peculiar situation where we go from a pandemic, which is still continuing, but I guess the emergency phase of the pandemic is over, and now we got this war in Ukraine that's also affecting everybody in various ways. It will affect this country as we, rightly accept in as many refugees as we can take, and so on. So we're living in really peculiar times, and so taking stock, I just think, is the appropriate theme. So the talk will be in two parts, and Breda will tap the glass, and I'm getting towards, if I'm beginning to run over time, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, and as I say, there'll be refreshments as well. So the two parts of the talk, one will be trying to summarise how COVID affected the churches, and then the second part will be, well, now that the emergency phase of the pandemic appears to be over, what issues are beginning to resurface that will be of particular concern to the Iona Institute. So the three I'm going to look at, because there's actually more, but time will allow, the review of the operation of the abortion law. Assisted suicide, unfortunately, is rearing its head again as a topic in a big way, and there's a big review underway about how relationships and sexuality education has been taught in schools at both primary and post-primary level, which is relevant. I mean, I could have also added, the ongoing debate about faith schools and divestment. We have this assisted human reproduction bill working its way through the Dáil, which is an appalling piece of work in many ways. So I could have got into that, but again, we just wouldn't have time. And we'll have, anyway, future events when we can consider these things. So anyway, to begin, so summing up where we've come from and why and where we are now after all that has happened over the last couple of years with the outbreak of COVID is no easy task. So I'm going to look in particular in this section, as I say, on COVID and its impact on the church. So obviously during the pandemic we were faced with this completely unprecedented situation where for the first time in the life of anybody in this church, you could not attend Mass, or whatever your church may be, or whatever your form of public worship may be. And that had never happened before, at least not that anybody could remember. I'm not even sure if it happened in the Spanish flu. I couldn't find any record of it happening during that. And I was looking around trying to find out, well, what happened in other countries in past outbreaks like this. And the only thing I could see was quarantine in Italy during the Black Plague, which was kind of understandable, really, when you think about it. But it was very hard to find a precedent for what happened. If you take the 60 weeks between the start of the pandemic, March of 2 years ago, around now, actually, I think it was exactly tonight 2 years ago that we went completely into lockdown. We had been beginning to bring in all these measures from around St. Patrick's Day 2 years ago, and I think it's today, 2 years ago, that full lockdown was imposed. So between that date and May of last year, I think it was 60 weeks, and in those 60 weeks, can you all hear me, by the way? In those 60 weeks, we couldn't go to church for 42 of them. And that was a long time, and it was the longest of any country in Europe. And I was keeping a really close eye on this, because kind of, professionally and personally interested to find out. And I was, keeping an eye on what all these other countries were doing during this period. And the only country I could find in Europe that came close to 42 weeks was Slovakia, which had a much, much worse outbreak than we had. Excuse me a second. Some countries, well, one country, never stopped public worship at all. And surprisingly, it was arguably the most secular country in Europe, which is Sweden. Sweden had no lockdown at all. They had all kinds of restrictions and curbs on numbers and that kind of thing, but they kept the churches open, limits on only about 30 who could attend public worship. But it was interesting that a very secular country like Sweden kept public worship going the entire time. It was easy to keep an eye on what was happening in Britain, and so Britain, or England rather, because the various areas were taking their own various approaches. But in the first lockdown, basically, from March of 2 years ago, every country stopped everything except for Sweden. So it wasn't just us who kind of stopped public worship, everybody had done it. And then, as summer approached, they began to relax the restrictions and people could go to Mass again, but again in limited numbers and social distancing, which was all perfectly understandable and defensible. And then, if you remember, as autumn of 2020 approached, it's kind of funny now, it's beginning to recede into the rearview mirror to a certain extent and try to remember some of these things that were happening. But around autumn of 2020, so about 18 months ago, in Dublin and a couple of other areas, we went back into lockdown. And then, of course, around Christmas time, there's this terrible new wave of it, and everybody went into lockdown again. But again, I was watching England and these other countries to see what they were doing. So in England, they stopped everything like we did during the first lockdown. And then, as the Christmas wave began to happen at the end of 2020, in autumn of 2020, Britain again, or England, stopped public worship. But notably, the leaders of all the main faiths in England, so Anglicanism, Catholicism, the Hindu leaders, Muslim leaders, Jewish leaders, etc., they wrote a joint letter to Boris Johnson and to the public health experts, and they said, you've got to justify this, because we've had our places of worship open for months, and there's been no recorded outbreaks, because we've been doing a great job at the social distancing, the hand sanitizing, the face masks. We have all these stewards who are leading people to their seats and making sure everything is being done properly. And like, if you remember, I guess it's not that long ago, churches did a fantastic job with all their volunteers. An army of volunteers across the country stepped up, and they helped to make sure churches kept safe. So anyway, all the various faith leaders wrote to Boris Johnson and they said, look, what's your justification for stopping public worship again? So actually they had a look and they decided, well, no, we're going to let you open again with restrictions on numbers and social distancing and all that sort of stuff. So Britain never had another lockdown for the churches. So from autumn of 2020, that was it. They were allowed to keep going to church, allowing again for limitations and numbers. But we took a different approach. So we had this autumn lockdown in some parts of the country, and then we had the winter lockdown from December 2020, and that lasted right through to May of last year. So that was a long stretch. But during the second lockdown, when it was imposed in Dublin in September 2020, so I spent a fair amount of time during that period between March 2020 and roughly September of 2020 going to NPHET press conferences. I was asking questions about the nursing homes, for example, and what have you. But when Dublin and a couple of other parts of the country were forced into lockdown again in September 2020, at that point, which is remarkable to me, because remember they had all these tiers, so tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 lockdown, and different things would have to shut down according to the tier or level of the restrictions. So under this particular type of lockdown, you couldn't go to Mass, but you could attend your hairdresser, or you could go to the gym. So this is kind of weird. And I remember asking, it was Ronan Glynn, who was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, he was standing in at that point for Tony Holohan, and I said, why are you allowed to go to the hairdresser, and why are you allowed to go to the gym, but you can't go to Mass? And so the answer, which always stuck in my mind, was because in the context of a pandemic, you have to close down the things considered less important. That to me was very telling. So therefore, going to Mass or whatever form of public worship was considered less important than keeping the hairdressers open and keeping the gyms open. Now, what that said to me was, we're trying to keep certain sections of the economy open, and the churches contribute nothing to the economy. So you have this kind of attitude. But again, at the same time, in Britain, you had all the religious leaders writing to Boris Johnson and said, what's the justification? And at the end, they just figured, well, actually, we don't have a good enough one, so you can reopen. But here, no. And that just persisted. And I was also watching what was happening in other countries in terms of direct action taken by Christians and others to try and get the restoration of public worship. So in France, I'll start with Italy. So in May 2020, Italy begins to reopen. Of course, Italy was very badly hit, if you remember, because that's what kind of had us also worried, the scenes from northern Italy and then Spain. So those countries went into lockdown in February of 2020, and Italy began to reopen somewhat in May. But he couldn't go back to Mass in May 2020, but things like museums began to reopen. And so the Italian bishops contacted the Italian Prime Minister and said, what's the story? Why can you go to museums but not to Mass? And so they made a fuss about it. And the Italian Prime Minister, I think a guy called Conte at that point, he said, well, I'm actually not sure. I'm not sure I can justify this. And so they began to allow people to go to Mass again. And I'm not sure that Italy ever again stopped people attending public worship. So I think it was only the first lockdown. I couldn't swear to that, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. Then France, what happened there was a very traditionalist Catholic group took the government to court, and it won. And they had to reopen public worship there as well. Now they closed it down later, but the grounds for the French court saying to the French government, you must allow public worship again, is because, again, they were reopening other parts of society. like museums, like gyms, like hairdressers. So it seemed like discrimination against the churches not to allow them to meet for public worship. So they won on grounds of discrimination, this traditionalist Catholic group. And in Germany there was a very similar case, except this time it was taken by Muslims, and they won. And in fact, I can hardly think of a single case where a religious group took their government to court and lost. So every court in these various countries was having to consider the same thing as our government and public health experts. They had to, okay, what's the right balance here, and what do we do, and what's the right balance between the rights to attend worship and public safety and health and all that kind of thing. And they were trying to strike the right proportional balance. But it's just interesting that whoever took the case in whatever country, the religious groups won their cases. And remember, the governments were in there arguing, no, we can't reopen, it's not safe. And some public health experts back in the government were saying, no, we can't reopen, it's not safe. But he heard from other experts saying it is safe, and anyway, it's discrimination if you're allowing these other sections of society, like hairdressers, to open. So it was interesting. So if you remember, here in this country there was a case taken, and it was taken by Declan Ganley. But Declan could never get his day in court. It was an amazing situation. Month after month after month he tries to get his case in court, and he just can't get a hearing. And it just kept on being delayed and delayed and delayed, so he never got his day. And finally, the court a few months ago, because at this stage we're out of lockdown and we can go back to Mass and everything, so this is well after May of last year, the judge says, well, it's not relevant now anyway, because you're able to go back. But you're kind of thinking, there's very important legal principles to be decided here, and constitutional principles. And if this was to happen again in the future, don't you think it's good that you have heard a case like this? It was like there had been a case in Scotland, similar, and it was heard. And again, our side, so to speak, won that case. But here, you couldn't get you couldn't even get a hearing. So I thought that was quite significant. Sorry, to see where I am in my notes. Okay, so what will be the effect on the churches, I wonder, of what's happened over the last couple of years? Because obviously church attendance dropped. It was dropping anyway, but to what extent was it accelerated? So the Iona Institute commissioned a number of opinion polls, and they were conducted by Amórach Research. And Amórach Research was doing all the research, by the way, for the government during the whole thing to find out what public attitudes were towards the various measures introduced. And so they would sometimes ask a couple of questions about after lockdowns, were people coming back to Mass and other places of worship. And the answer is maybe about half were back who were going before. And we asked a question again recently, and it was still about half. Now, speaking to priests in various parts of the country, anecdotally, I think maybe 60 to 70% are back compared to what was going before. But that's obviously still a pretty steep reduction on what was happening before. So if 30%, we'd say, are not back, will they ever come back? Or are they simply gone, not to return? So we don't know that yet. But I dare say, in some cases, that will be so. These opinion polls we'd commissioned, we'd ask people, well, okay, so why haven't you come back? And some people were saying, well, I want things to go completely back to normal. I don't like the social distancing. I don't like having to wear the mask, so I just want there to be complete normality, and then I'll come back. And other people were saying, I've got used to watching it online at home, and I like that. And you see what was happening as well in terms of online. People were able to find a mass they liked, and music they liked, and a priest whose preaching they liked. So they could shop around an awful lot more than they used to, couldn't they? And they said, well, I like this church now, and that I'm watching in England, or whatever the case may be, and I'm going to stick with that. So that seemed to be a bit of a phenomenon as well. And obviously, there's quite a number of people still scared, understandably, to come into a crowded place now, particularly the social distancing is gone, and what have you. And it'll be just interesting to see, now that the pandemic looks like it's just not going to go away fully, and we're going to get continual waves, what will happen? So that also remains to be seen. What was also happening, by the way, as far as these opinion polls were concerned, was a lot of people were tuning in online, and it roughly equated to the numbers who were going to Mass before the whole thing began. And there were people praying more than they did, which is understandable too, because you'd be fearful, particularly when it broke out and we didn't quite know what we were facing. So it's not as if religious practice came to an end during the lockdown. It continued, because it did continue online. People did tune into Mass. People were praying at home. They were praying for family members. They were praying for people they were concerned about. So it's not like religious practice ground to a halt, because it didn't. We talk about people losing the habit of going, and you get people saying sometimes, "Oh well, sure, if they were only going on a habit, maybe it's not such a bad thing, because that's all it was." But you know what? Good habits are good, and it's not a good thing to lose a good habit, is it? And coming to Mass is a good habit, even if it's purely habitual, because it's a good thing to get out of the house. It's a good thing to meet your neighbours. It's a good thing to come to worship. Okay, so all these things are good things, even if it's not as deep in some cases as we might like. And when you think about, one of the most important institutions to my mind in Irish life and elsewhere is the 10 o'clock Mass. There's so many people, and they meet their neighbours at the 10 o'clock Mass. And I wonder what it did for people when they couldn't go to that, and the feelings of isolation they must have had during that period when they couldn't go to the 10 o'clock Mass and meet their neighbours and so on. Now, I think, how are we doing for time? Okay. I think that what various countries did to public worship during the various lockdowns was a bit of a litmus test for how well regarded churches and religion are in society. And I compared us to other countries and how we had the longest lockdown or the longest shutout of Mass and public worship of any country in Europe, more than secular countries, which are at least ostensibly a lot more secular than us. So what did that say about the status of religion in Ireland? And what did the answer I got at the NEFID press conferences? Well, we're closing down things considered less important in the context of a pandemic. And I don't think it was born out of hostility. I think it came more out of a kind of indifference, to be honest. But again, interesting to me that Boris Johnson listens to the religious leaders there, that courts in countries like France and Scotland and Germany were much more receptive to the arguments in favour of allowing people to come back to public worship, who can then obviously make their own decisions about whether they still think it's too risky. I think it was also a bit of a litmus test for the churches themselves. And so, how were we striking the balance between public safety and health on the one hand, and freedom of worship on the other? And were we getting the balance right? Because when you saw bishops in France taking a case, as they did eventually, and Scottish bishops backing a case, and American bishops in various states were taking court cases as well, and the bishops here didn't take any case, and you're wondering, are they being overly safe here? And like the Pope was saying, we need to restore public worship as quick as we can, and he more or less backed what the Italian bishops were doing, and in other countries too, more or less. Wasn't being too outspoken about it, didn't want to interfere too much, and there was this kind of passivity here, and I just wonder if the passivity was overdone somewhat, but I don't want to be too critical because it's easy to be. Now, here to me is a very paradoxical thing that came up in the whole context of the lockdowns and restrictions. So if you remember, the big slogan during the abortion referendum was "My body, my choice." All right, so during the lockdown, that went out the window. We didn't have "My body, my choice" anymore. We have to lock down. You have to curb your freedom. You must do so for the sake of other people, because you might harm other people. You might give the infection to other people, or you might end up in hospital taking up a hospital bed, and that was unnecessary if you had looked after yourself properly. So suddenly "My body, my choice" vanished as a slogan. I'm not saying, by the way, that's a bad thing by any stretch, but it was just funny to me that in May 2018, in the name of "My body, my choice," we repealed the 8th Amendment by a margin of 2-1. And you go from May 2018 to March 2020, and suddenly that's gone. And it's all about the common good. Now, what institution has been teaching and preaching about the common good for hundreds upon hundreds of years? Only the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has always said your own personal autonomy is important, but is not the only thing, that there's other things to be considered 2. And so the church defines common good as what? This is from the Catechism. So the common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So I'll read that again. Common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So we just don't say it's all up to each individual to do exactly what they want, regardless of what effect it'll have on other people. So we got to take the social and common good into account as well. And that's completely what we were doing during the pandemic. And there was an absolutely legitimate argument to be made: are we overdoing the restrictions? Are we underdoing the restrictions? And Catholics can absolutely disagree with this. So you could say, I think it was justified to stop us going to Mass for 42 weeks out of the 60. Or you might say that went too far. Or you might say it didn't go far enough. So that's completely justifiable, understandable kind of argument we can have among ourselves. But at the heart of the argument is an argument about the common good and where to strike the balance between the social good on the one hand and individual freedom on the other. And I just think it provides a fantastic teaching moment for the church to begin speaking about the common good again, because it's exactly what we were all about during the worst of the pandemic. Now, so ends part 1. So just a bit of a look back at some of the issues which arose. And the issues, by the way, are still very important, because we'll have to debate for years to come what was the common good during the pandemic and what was the proper and proportionate response. All right, so the 3 issues that are worth talking about for a few minutes that are, resurfacing now, that some semblance of semi-normality is returning. These, again, will be of concern to the Iona Institute and people who support it, including in this church. So the big one at the moment is the review of the operation of the abortion law. Now, it's important to say the law itself is not under review. People can often think it's the law that's under review, but it's not. It's how the law has been operated and carried out over the 3 years. Because it was introduced while we had a referendum in May of 2018. The law came into effect in January of 2019. So in January of this year, it's been going for 3 years. So the government, when they introduced abortion, said, we'll have a review of how it's been going after 3 years. And of course, the short answer is it's been going appallingly. Because there's been, in the first 2 years of its operation, there was about 13,500 abortions, which is just a horrendous figure. I mean, even if you allow for people ordering the abortion pill online, added to the numbers going to England, you might have had about 5,000 a year taking place. So that comes to about 10,000 over 2 years. So the figure actually, when you include women still going to England, in 2 years was 14,000. So it went from a maximum of 10 to 14, so at least a 40% increase. So this is the most horrendous law ever entered into the Irish statute books, because it has resulted in the loss of so many lives, and lives actually in the period preceding the 8th Amendment, or if the 8th Amendment still existed, would not have been lost. So there's a lot of children would be alive today were it not for that law. So it's been a disaster. But we're not allowed apparently to review the law, so we're only reviewing how it operated. So the Iona Institute submission, we had to concentrate on that. So we looked at a few things. So when they introduced lockdown, they also said you don't have to come to a doctor anymore to get the abortion pill. Physically, you don't have to come in person to the doctor. You can do this remotely online, have the abortion pill sent out to your house. So so-called telemedicine or DIY abortion. Now in England they were doing the same thing, but they've stopped it because they're saying, well, hang on a minute, if you're not seeing the doctor physically, what happens if something goes wrong? And so they've reversed it, and they've gone back to having to see the doctor physically and in person. So we need to do that. Now, obviously, we'd prefer if there was no such law, but we're only looking at the way it operated, so they need to end this telemedicine abortion. Collect proper abortion data. So here's a really weird thing. When they introduced the abortion law, they said we're going to collect hardly any data. So all you get is the number of abortions per county and not much else. So the report is extremely threadbare. But if you look at what other countries do, and these are countries that have had abortion for decades, like England or America or Sweden or whatever, they collect absolutely heaps of data. But here we seem to decide no, it's intrusive to ask too many questions, it's an invasion of privacy, why would you want to have any more information? That's prurient. This was the kind of debate that was going on in the Dáil when people like Senator Roland Mullen or Peadar Tobin or some of the other pro-life TDs were saying, we need to gather more information. In every other health area, which is not a health area strictly speaking, they gather heaps of information because they want to know, well, okay, who are the people most susceptible to X, Y, or Z? So they can hone in on it and say, well, okay, what do we do here? And why is this particular group more susceptible? But with abortion, there's none of that. So like in America, they can tell you exactly who's most likely to have an abortion because they collect tons of data. So the most likely person, it's the same in Britain, by the way, poor, is understandable, ethnic minority because they're more often likely to be poor, about 25 years of age, already has a child, unmarried. So that's the most likely person. And I'd be incredibly surprised if it's much different here, because when Irish women are going to England, they would collect the data and you can see all this data. But here, no data. So that needs to be changed. It's ridiculous. And even the Irish Family Planning Association, which is as pro-abortion as could be, they want more data collected because they want more information. But here, no. That could be very easily changed. Now, another thing that needs to be looked at, they need to end providing women, couples, with misleading information about prenatal tests, prenatal screening, because we introduced the abortion law in January of 2019, and then a few weeks later you have this horrible case occurred in Holles Street, the National Maternity Hospital, where a couple go in and they're told via a scan, your baby's going to die. So they proceeded to a termination. This is all in the public record. And then the baby turns out to be perfectly healthy. And then they look back, okay, you're telling us this is like 98% accurate or something. And they look back and discover, actually, that's a completely misleading claim. Now, I won't go into the science of it because I find it actually quite complicated to work out. How can you say it's 98% accurate, but it's not really? So there's all kinds of maths and everything going on there. But anyway, and to cut a long story short, those prenatal tests in their accuracy claims are incredibly misleading, and they are leading babies to be unnecessarily aborted, even from a pro-choice perspective. And if this is all about providing accurate information, then why aren't they providing accurate information about the prenatal tests? And they're not doing it. And a lot of these providers of these tests are still not providing correct information, and the HSE isn't. So that could be very easily changed. And again, even if you're pro-choice, why wouldn't you want to provide completely accurate information about the accuracy of these tests? Another thing, the HSE should officially allow the use of something called abortion reversal pills. So when a woman is given the abortion pill, she actually gets two. So one kind of prepares the way, as it were, and the second one carries out the deed. So it basically induces a miscarriage. But in between, it's like if a woman comes in miscarrying, there's a particular drug she can take to try and reverse it and stop the miscarriage taking place. And so you can call that an abortion or miscarriage reversal pill. And so there was a doctor in England, in fact a number of doctors offering these, and they work apparently about half the time. So this particular doctor in England, he's Irish, his name is Dr. Dermot Kearney, met him, fantastic guy. So they reckon he saved about 20 or 30 babies this way. In Ireland there are some doctors doing this, but it's not officially authorised, it's not against medical practice either. But seriously, if a woman changes her mind, why wouldn't you facilitate her to have this abortion reversal pill? Again, if you're pro-choice, this is now her choice. So you facilitate it. So they should allow that too, officially. And they should make it widely known among doctors. So if a woman has come to a doctor and she's taken one of the abortion pills and she says, actually, I don't want to go through with this, every doctor in Ireland should know about the abortion reversal pill and know how to get it and how to administer it, because it could save an awful lot of lives. Sorry. So next, there was a study came out maybe a bit over a year ago, and it was a study and interviews with doctors who actually carry out abortions in Irish hospitals. And one of the things that came out that got almost no publicity, there are some babies aborted late term, I'm sorry now to slightly gross you out maybe, who are born alive and left to die. And there have been fights between doctors. What happens to this baby? Because, it could be a 6 months. 5 months. So it's still alive. So what do we do with it? And so fights are going on between doctors, and some of the doctors say, look, nothing to do with me. And then these other doctors who carried out the termination say, well, what do we do? I don't know what to do. And so the babies are left to die. This is horrendous. Got no publicity. You see, in the run-up to the abortion referendum, all the hard cases like the Miss C's and the Miss X's, undoubted hard cases, were used to chip away at public support for the 8th Amendment. But there are loads of hard cases for the pro-choice side as well. And they get no publicity whatsoever. So that case of the couple of the Hollis Street, that was not allowed to become a cause célèbre in the same way that these other cases I was mentioning were, because nothing must be allowed to interfere with the tranquility of our faith in the abortion law, to paraphrase John Charles McQuaid from another occasion talking about Vatican II. So they don't allow these hard cases to emerge. So here we have this study about these babies born alive after a late-term abortion and left to die. No publicity. Ignored. This is happening, of course, everywhere, not just in Ireland. So they need to investigate that thoroughly. And then finally, on this point, there's evidence, this is direct evidence from the HSE, about 20% of women who go to see a doctor about having an abortion changes her mind and doesn't have it. Now, she doesn't even take, under those circumstances, the first abortion pill. Now, if there was proper counselling of pro-life alternatives, how many more women would change their mind? And again, even if you're pro-choice, right? In fact, if you're pro-choice, you should want women to be given all available information about her alternatives so they can make a proper choice. All right? So all of these things I'm listing here, because they're about the operation of the law, all of them ought to be compatible with a pro-choice ethic. So if they're really pro-choice, they should have no trouble changing the operation of the law in these respects. Now, assisted suicide. The Special Oireachtas Committee has been set up to investigate this. The original bill was introduced by Jean O'Kenny, TD, as a private member's bill, a horrendous piece of work. It would limit assisted suicide to the terminally ill. Doesn't specify how long you have to be before death. Terminally ill is so loosely defined it could include dementia. So actually what looks like a limited law, not a bit limited, but the law is so incredibly badly drafted that the government said we can't go ahead with this, and it's not our bill anyway, so they set up the special committee to investigate it. And I don't think that special committee has begun to meet yet, but if you're paying attention, you may have noticed, like the likes of RTE, frankly, has effectively begun to campaign for this. And they're operating out of exactly the same playbook that they were in the run-up to the abortion referendum. So a concentration on the hard cases, and there are undoubtedly hard cases of people who are very seriously ill. They're also saying, well, it's my body, my choice. So we're back to that. And so the compassion argument, the choice argument, the hard cases. So straight out of the playbook in a run-up to the repeal of the 8th Amendment. And, you know, what's going to stop this? Well, to my mind, it has to be people who are against assisted suicide who are themselves very seriously ill. And there are people, of course, in that category, plenty of them, who are against euthanasia because they know it'll target them. Because if you're watching a programme and there's somebody on this with some horrible degenerative disease and they're saying to the interviewer, I'd like the option of a lethal injection at some point, everybody else at home in that same situation is hearing the message, you're better off dead. And we understand that that's what you want to happen to you. Now, actually, how is that really compassionate at the end of the day? So there are people with these conditions who are willing to go on programmes. They've gone on the odd one, but are rarely interviewed. So more of them on programmes. Most doctors are still against this, particularly palliative care doctors. So if it's all about compassion, and palliative care doctors, their expertise is dealing with people approaching the end of their life, shouldn't they be the very people most in favour? But are the very people most against, because they see the terrible message it gives to their patients, your life isn't worth living anymore. All right, so that's why the palliative care doctors are especially opposed. So I think what to stop this, if anything can, there doesn't need to be a referendum, by the way, it can just be passed in the Oireachtas. What has to happen is we need to hear lots of vulnerable people who are against it, and we need to hear lots from doctors that may begin to change the public mind somewhat on it. So the final thing I'll bring up here among those issues. They're beginning to review, it's already well underway actually, how relationships and sexuality education is being taught at both primary and post-primary level. So the demand is that RSE be objective, factual, and value-free. Now what I want to know is, how do you have relationships and sexuality education that's value-free? Because the stress here is on the word relationships. You can't have value-free relationships. That'd be ridiculous. Nobody marries somebody to have a value-free marriage, do they? Nobody goes out with somebody to have a value-free relationship. So how in the world can anybody propose teaching RSE in a way that's value-free? So they can't really mean it. So what they really mean is they want RSE taught in a way that's free of Christian values. That's what they mean. And what they mean is we can't have Catholic and faith schools teaching RSE with the values that they like. It has to be only the values that we like. And so when it boils down to it, what is the value that they want RSE boiled down to? And it's the value of consent alone. So long as there's consent, everything is A-OK. And a relationship, never mind marriage, is a strictly optional extra. Apart from that, let's have a total free-for-all. So that's what they want, sex education and relationships education boiled down to, that consent alone is enough. And of course we want more than that, because we think consent alone is not enough. And even if people say, well, it's all old hat saying wait until marriage. Well, seriously, you don't even know the person? Is that an acceptable set of values to be teaching our children? There are people close to the review process for RSE, and they believe in so-called ethical porn, which is just astounding. And they also want primary school children taught that even if you have a male body, you might really be female, or vice versa. And the question to me is this what parents want their children taught? Because at the end of the day, it has to be what the parents want, because the Catholic Church teaches this anyway, that the primary educators are parents. So whatever is taught in the schools, particularly in an area as intimate as RSE, the parents should want it. And I just wonder if parents would want some of the stuff which I've just listed. So what can we do? So obviously the scale of this task is absolutely huge and daunting. So I think what is probably going to happen is what we're going through now has to burn itself out. And I think it will eventually burn itself out. It'll do a lot of damage along the way. But every set of values, the whole history of humankind, eventually burns itself out, and gets replaced. So what we're going through now is not going to last forever. It will eventually fade out. Now again, it could cause immense damage in the meantime. So what's our job? Well, our job is to keep the faith. To keep up our immune system, as it were, against some of what's been preached and taught. To try and influence the people around us as best we can. Not in an argumentative or aggressive way, but by way of example, by showing a different form of living that might make people curious. Well, why do you do this? And why do you believe that? And, why isn't your life a mess? Assuming it's not. Because a lot of this is making a complete mess of people's lives. So we have to be this leaven within society and this kind of witness. So we can't be demoralized and we can't give up. We got to stay faithful, because that's what God ultimately asks of us. I've said before in previous talks, we don't get to choose the time we live in. And you might want to live in a time where the faith is stronger, but that's not our choice. We're born when we're born, and we're in the age that we're in and in the place that we're in. So what we have to do is the best with the time that we live in. So our job is to be faithful in whatever our circumstances are and whatever life hands over to us. And we'd like to be in an age where the culture of life was rising up, wouldn't we? Instead of this culture of death. That'd be fantastic. But we're not in that time. But we've got to do our best to keep this culture of life alive as best we can. And even an event like this, it's a small contribution to that, and you coming out tonight is also a contribution to that, because you're going to meet each other and you're going to renew old friendships and acquaintances, and we can have more of our public events going forward, because to my mind, an event where you can meet in person is far better than these virtual events. They were important, but there's nothing like meeting people physically. And by the way, we can take part in the synodal process, which is going on in Dublin Diocese at the moment. Now, I was a little bit sceptical about this, and there was still a certain scepticisms, but I went along to my parish synodal process there last week. Second part is actually on tonight. And you just meet these lovely faith-filled people. And so we're all divided up into these groups of 6. And the 2 questions, which were slightly namby-pamby for my liking, but anyway, there you go. So one was, what experience of the church gives you joy, and what experience of the church gives you sorrow? But you just hear people talking in this very unaffected way about their faith, and I'm very grateful to my parents for passing me on the faith. And I like good sermons, and I like good music, and I like good liturgy, and I'm really appreciative to Father so-and-so or Sister so-and-so, or whatever the case may be. And then when I turn to the things that make them sad, they mention things like, well, declining vocations, the ageing cohorts, and the scandals, of course. So these were the sort of things. But I mean, what I sometimes point out in these occasions when we look at the ageing cohorts is, well, you know what? It's not just us. The average reader of the Irish Times is probably about 60 years of age. The average viewer of RTE is probably about the same. Political parties are ageing. Trade unions are ageing. Society is ageing in a big way. We're not having enough children. So we kind of think it's only us, the church. So it's only us who are losing the young members, but it's not true, actually. We're further down the line, but it's not just us. So the revival that the church needs is actually a revival that lots of other areas of society need as well. There's an awful lot of society needs revitalising. And actually, as the church goes, and as religion goes to some extent, so goes society. Because to my mind, when a society loses faith in religion, and it loses faith in God, it actually loses faith in itself ultimately. And it turns in on itself. And you get this kind of individualism, where people turn away from all forms of commitment that make demands. So even marriage is in decline. Fewer people get married. It's very demanding. Having children is really demanding. So a lot fewer people are having children. And it's not just connected with the cost of living, because you look all around Europe, all around America, where the cost of living varies, and birth rates are still in massive, steep decline. So this is a revitalisation that's not just the church needs, that society as a whole needs. But anyway, for the time being, we do our best to influence society. But with the synodal process, we can at least try and influence the church. So thank you for your time.